It was the dead of night, maybe 2 in the morning, and the house was absolutely silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I'd gotten up for water, my mind still racing from days of fragmented suspicions. Sarah's phone was charging on the kitchen counter, screen down as usual. Then, a soft glow. A notification. Before it faded, I saw it clearly. A text message. From Mike. It read, "Tomorrow we talk about moving you in." That was it. That was the moment. The gut-wrenching confirmation that turned every uneasy feeling, every whispered doubt, into a cold, hard certainty. This wasn't some casual rekindling or an emotional affair. This was a blueprint. My stomach didn't drop, it just solidified. See, I'm David. In my mid-30s, an engineer by trade. And for 9 years, I'd been married to Sarah. We had 2 incredible kids, Ethan, who's 7 and a walking encyclopedia of questions, and Chloe, our 5-year-old tornado who believed our living room couch was a personal trampoline. The house we lived in? It technically belonged to Sarah's parents, Robert and Margaret. They'd bought it for estate planning, a stable place for us after Ethan was born. Sarah never let me forget that. Especially when we argued. "You don't own anything here," she'd snap, or "This isn't your house." Looking back, she wasn't just winning petty arguments. She was testing the waters, figuring out how much leverage she truly had. The first real tremor, the first crack in what I thought was our stable foundation, came about 6 months before that text message. Sarah mentioned Mike. An old college friend, she said, reconnected at some alumni event. At first, I didn't think much of it. We both had friends from our past. But then her phone habits changed overnight. Face down all the time. Notifications off. The instant I walked into a room, her screen would flip away, like I was trying to crack a top-secret code. Her excuses got progressively stranger. 70% battery and it's dying. Gym visits where her location sharing was conveniently off. Being an engineer, I don't operate on gut feelings alone. I started tracking. Logging inconsistencies. When she left, when she returned, the excuses. The timeline quickly stopped adding up. Then came the Sunday dinner at Robert and Margaret's. Sarah, looking across the table at her parents, not at me, dropped a casual bomb. "If David and I ever split up," she said, so nonchalant, obviously I'd stay in the house with the kids, and he'd figure something out elsewhere. Robert and Margaret went quiet. Margaret quickly changed the subject to Ethan's school project, and the moment just passed. Unaddressed. Unacknowledged. But I heard it. The next piece fell into place because of Ethan. Kids, bless their honest hearts, are terrible secret keepers. He had no idea he was delivering a truth bomb. We were driving home from school, and he just blurted out, "Mom's friend Mike took us for ice cream last week. He let me get 2 scoops." I asked when, trying to keep my voice steady, completely normal. He said it was the afternoon Sarah told me she was taking them to the park. Sarah, from the passenger seat, immediately jumped in. It wasn't just Mike. It was a whole group thing. "Don't make it weird, David." But Ethan hadn't mentioned a group. He'd said Mom's friend Mike. Mike wasn't just some distant reconnection anymore. He was already inside the perimeter. With my kids. I didn't confront her that evening. I was still gathering data. But that night, the night I found Mike's text, I took a photo of the screen with my own phone. My hands were perfectly steady. I went back to bed without saying a single word. That message told me everything. She wasn't just having an affair. She'd already written the entire script for my exit and Mike's entrance. I was just the last one to get a copy of the revised production schedule. That Saturday, Sarah took the kids to what she called the park, but her location sharing mysteriously stopped. My calls went straight to voicemail. I checked our shared family calendar, and there it was, a block for brunch near Mike's neighborhood the following weekend. The next morning, Sunday, around 9, I drove past his apartment complex in Atlanta. Not because I'm some jealous maniac, but because I needed to confirm. Was I losing my mind, or was this real? Her car was parked right outside his building. She came home around noon, acting completely normal. Asking about my morning, chatting about taking the kids to her parents for an overnight. I just nodded, my brain meticulously cataloging every single lie. The kids ended up staying at Robert and Margaret's that night. Sarah just texted, "They're sleeping at my parents'. I need a break." As if she had unilateral decision-making power over our children's whereabouts. When she finally came home Monday night, that's when she decided to lay all her cards out. She walked in, didn't even take off her jacket, and said, "I'm with Mike now. I want a divorce. I'm staying in this house with the kids, and you can see them on weekends." She said it like she was reading items off a grocery list, matter of fact, like she'd already received management approval. Then came the part that made my blood run cold. "When you move out, Mike's going to move in. My parents will understand that I need support during this transition." I just stared at her. And then I asked the only question that mattered, "You're seriously planning to move your boyfriend into your parents' house where our kids sleep?" She actually rolled her eyes. Like I was being dramatic. She said Mike was great with kids, that Ethan already liked him, and that this was happening whether I agreed or not. She told me I had until the end of the week to find somewhere else. And she'd already talked to a lawyer about custody. I could see she was expecting me to explode, or crumble. Both, probably. Instead, I just walked to our bedroom and started packing a bag. She followed me, looking almost triumphant, thinking she'd finally broken me. She even started talking about splitting holidays, how civil we could keep things if I just cooperated. I zipped up the bag, walked back to the living room, and sat down on her couch, the spot she jokingly called her throne. She looked genuinely confused. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I'm not leaving," I told her, very clearly. "I am not vacating this house so you can move another man into the bedrooms where my children sleep. That is absolutely not happening." Her face went from confused to absolutely furious in half a second. She started yelling. About how I couldn't stop her. How she'd call the cops. How her parents would obviously take her side, like they always had. I let her finish her entire rant. Without interrupting. And then I said something that made her go completely silent. "Tomorrow morning," I told her, "the people who actually own this house are going to hear the truth about your plan. And we'll see if they're really on your side when they know what you're actually trying to do." The color visibly drained from her face. She realized I wasn't bluffing. The next morning, I got in my car and drove straight to Robert's office downtown. His office building in Dallas was one of those old, serious structures. Marble floors, brass fixtures. Not the kind of place you just drop into. I didn't call ahead. I knew if I did, Sarah would somehow find out and get to them first with her version. The receptionist said Robert was in a meeting, but I said I'd wait. About 20 minutes later, she said he could see me. And when I walked into his office, Margaret was already there, too. They both looked concerned, not annoyed. Like they'd sensed something serious was coming. I sat down and told them I needed to show them some things, and I just needed them to listen, without interrupting, until I was completely finished. Robert nodded, leaned back. Margaret folded her hands in her lap. I pulled out my phone and started laying out the timeline, exactly like I was presenting an engineering failure analysis report. I showed them the photo of Mike's text about moving in. I showed them the shared calendar with Sarah's brunch reservation near his apartment. I pulled up our phone records, dozens of calls between Sarah and Mike at odd hours over the past 6 months. And I explained about Ethan accidentally mentioning the ice cream trip that Sarah had explicitly lied about. I told them Sarah's exact words from the night before, how she planned to stay in the house and move Mike in once I left, and how she'd specifically said, "My parents will understand that I need support." The room was completely silent. Robert's expression got progressively harder with every piece of evidence. Margaret's face just looked sad, exhausted, like she'd been dreading this conversation for years. When I finished, Robert didn't explode. He didn't accuse me of lying. He didn't jump to his daughter's defense the way Sarah had predicted. Instead, he looked at Margaret and said, "This is what we were afraid of." Margaret nodded slowly. Then she looked directly at me and said something that made my stomach drop. "We found messages between Sarah and Mike about 3 years ago," she said, "when we borrowed her laptop. We confronted her, and she swore it was over. She promised us she'd cut all contact and focus on her family." I just sat there, processing. This wasn't months. This had been going on for years. And her parents already knew Mike wasn't some innocent old college friend. Robert stood up and walked to the window. He was quiet for maybe 30 seconds, just looking out at the city. Then he turned around. "The house was supposed to provide stability for our grandchildren," he said. "It was never meant to be leveraged for this kind of situation." He said Sarah could make whatever choices she wanted about her marriage, but she absolutely wasn't going to use their property to facilitate moving her boyfriend in with their grandkids. Margaret added that they'd been watching Sarah's behavior change over the past year, the secretiveness, the attitude, the way she'd started treating me like I was temporary or disposable. They'd hoped she'd come to her senses, but clearly that hadn't happened. Robert said we were going to handle this as a family meeting tonight at 7. Everyone at the house. Sarah needed to hear directly from them that her plan wasn't going to work the way she thought it would. Margaret told me to be there, and to stay calm, no matter what Sarah said, because she was going to absolutely explode. Sarah came home around 5 with groceries, like it was just another regular evening. She was humming, talking about dinner. I didn't say anything about where I'd been or what was coming in 2 hours. At exactly 7, Robert and Margaret showed up. Sarah opened the door with this big, welcoming smile, thinking they were just stopping by. But her expression changed instantly when she saw how serious they both looked. Robert said, "We need to talk. Everyone sit down right now." Sarah's smile faded completely. She sat on the couch, looking confused and slightly annoyed, probably thinking I'd called them over to complain about the divorce. Robert didn't waste time with small talk. "We know about Mike," he said. "We know about your plan to move him into this house. And we know you've been lying to all of us for years." Sarah's face went through about 5 different expressions in 3 seconds: shock, panic, anger, all fighting for control. Then she strategically landed on tears. She started crying, saying I'd twisted everything, taken things out of context, that Mike was just a friend helping her through a difficult time. Margaret just shook her head. "We saw the messages, Sarah. The same way we saw them 3 years ago when you promised us it was over." Sarah switched tactics immediately. The tears dried up. She started yelling about how they were choosing me over their own daughter. How could they possibly believe some outsider instead of their own blood? She was screaming at them, "I'm your child, and you're supposed to support me no matter what I do. If you kick me out, I'll make sure you never see your grandkids again." That's when Robert's expression went completely cold. He's usually this warm, grandfatherly type, but right then, he looked like a judge handing down a life sentence. He told Sarah that if she wanted to involve Child Protective Services or make threats about the grandkids, she should be fully prepared to explain to those authorities why she wanted to move her boyfriend into a house that didn't belong to her, while her minor children were living there. Sarah's brain seemed to completely freeze. You could actually see the moment she realized her nuclear option would blow up directly in her own face. Margaret said, "You're going to pack your essential things tonight, and you're going to leave. David and the children are staying here. And Mike is never setting foot in this house." Sarah tried to argue, but Robert cut her off. "The house was legally in their name," he said, and they could decide who lived there. Their decision was final. Sarah looked at me like she expected me to say something, or gloat, or get into a fight with her. But I just sat there quietly. This wasn't my conversation to have anymore. This was between her and the consequences of her own choices. She stood up and screamed that we'd all regret this, that she'd get a lawyer and take everything. Then she stormed to the bedroom and started violently throwing things into suitcases. The sound of drawers slamming and hangers scraping echoed through the house. Ethan called from upstairs, asking what was happening. Margaret went up to reassure him while Robert and I just waited in the living room, listening to Sarah's complete meltdown. She came out 20 minutes later with 2 suitcases and a garbage bag stuffed with clothes, mascara running down her face in dark streaks. She looked at her parents one final time, like she was waiting for them to change their minds. When they didn't say anything, she walked out and slammed the door so violently that a picture frame fell off the wall. We heard her car engine start and tires screech as she peeled out of the driveway. Then the house was just eerily quiet. The next few days were strange and tense. Sarah wouldn't answer any of my calls, but she was absolutely blowing up her parents' phones with messages about how betrayed she felt. I found out she'd actually moved in with Mike because a letter showed up for her from the post office about a change of address. When I looked up the address, it was Mike's apartment complex. She'd also apparently put utility bills in her name at that address, which I carefully documented and saved. I knew we were heading toward a serious legal fight. Then, exactly 1 week after she moved out, I got a call from Ethan's school. The principal said they'd received a concerning safety report from Sarah about unsafe conditions at home, and they were legally required to forward it to Child Protective Services. My stomach dropped. She was going completely scorched earth. She couldn't win through her parents, so now she was trying to weaponize the system against me. The CPS worker, a tired-looking woman named Denise, who'd clearly seen every manipulation tactic in the book, showed up the next afternoon. She walked through the house, talked to the kids separately, asked them detailed questions, and then sat down with me, Robert, and Margaret, who'd rushed over. Denise looked at her notes and said, "I'm marking this as a retaliatory filing. The children are clearly well cared for, and there's no evidence of anything concerning here." She said it happens sometimes in custody disputes, and it usually backfires very badly in court. 2 days later, my lawyer called. Sarah's attorney had filed for emergency temporary custody orders, claiming I was keeping the children from her and creating an unsafe environment. We had a court date scheduled for the following Monday, just 3 days away. My lawyer said to bring every single piece of documentation I had. This was going to get extremely ugly. The courthouse on Monday morning had that specific kind of tension. Everyone pretending to be calm, but you could physically feel the stress radiating off people. Sarah showed up looking completely different from the screaming mess who'd slammed out of the house 2 weeks earlier. She had on a conservative navy dress and minimal makeup, designed to project responsible mother to a family court judge. Her friend Ashley was with her for moral support, shooting me genuinely hateful looks like I was some kind of villain. My lawyer had prepped me extensively. He said Sarah's attorney would try to paint me as controlling, maybe dangerous. We needed to stay calm and let the evidence speak for itself. Sarah's lawyer went first, laying out a narrative about how she'd been trapped in an unhappy marriage, how I'd controlled finances and isolated her. How she'd found the courage to leave, but now I was weaponizing her parents and the house to keep her from her children. She actually teared up while her lawyer was talking, dabbing at her eyes with tissues she'd clearly brought for this purpose. Ashley nodded along in the background. When it was our turn, my lawyer didn't waste time with emotional appeals. He just started methodically laying out documentation, like he was building a brick wall, one piece at a time. The change of address form for Mike's apartment. The utility bills she'd put in her name there. A clear timeline showing she'd moved out voluntarily before any custody orders existed. Then he pulled out the screenshot of Mike's text message. He asked the judge to note that Sarah had actively planned to move her boyfriend into a house where minor children resided, a house that didn't belong to her, without any discussion whatsoever with their father or the actual property owners. He presented school records showing Mike had already been around the kids without my knowledge or consent, which Sarah had lied about repeatedly. My lawyer also submitted the CPS report, marked retaliatory and unfounded, pointing out that filing false reports was a serious issue that spoke directly to Sarah's judgment and credibility. Then Robert took the stand. That's when things really shifted. He explained that he and Margaret had purchased the house specifically as a stable environment for their grandchildren, part of their long-term estate planning. They'd made the decision for me and the kids to remain there, because stability was the absolute priority. The judge asked Robert directly whether he and his wife supported their daughter having primary custody. Robert said something I'll genuinely never forget. "We support our grandchildren having consistency," he said, "and we support the parent who chose to stay with them over the parent who chose to leave." The judge made it very clear this was a temporary emergency order pending a full custody hearing in 60 days. But her reasoning was specific and direct. Temporary primary residence would be with me, at the house owned by the grandparents. Sarah would have supervised visitation every other weekend, plus one evening during the week. Mike was prohibited from being around the children for a minimum of 6 months while Sarah demonstrated actual stability. The judge also noted that any future attempts to file false CPS reports or make unsubstantiated allegations would result in an immediate reduction of custody time, and she strongly encouraged both parties to focus on co-parenting rather than continued conflict. Sarah looked like she'd been physically slapped. Her mouth was actually hanging open. When we walked out into the courthouse corridor, she completely lost it. She started screaming at me, right there in the hallway, with court officers actively watching. Yelling about how I'd stolen her life, turned her own parents against her, ruined absolutely everything. I didn't yell back. I just told her, very calmly, that she'd given up her life when she decided to move her boyfriend into the bedrooms where our kids slept. And then I walked away while she was still screaming. Ashley had to physically pull her toward the exit before security got involved. I heard Sarah sobbing all the way down the hall. The social media war started that same night. Sarah posted this long, tearful message about being a mother torn from her children by a vindictive ex and complicit in-laws. Ashley was in the comments aggressively fighting anyone who dared ask reasonable questions about why Sarah had moved out, or who Mike actually was. I didn't respond publicly, my lawyer explicitly told me not to engage. But I did post one single sentence: "Some people leave their family long before they physically walk out the door." That post got shared by people who knew us, and the narrative started cracking when Jessica showed up in the comments. Jessica had been Sarah's absolute best friend since college, inseparable for years. But they'd had some major falling out around the time Mike reappeared. I'd never known why. Jessica wrote this comment: "I watched her plan this for months. She wanted to have her new relationship completely set up before leaving, and now she's shocked there were consequences." People started asking Jessica questions, and she answered some of them. Nothing cruel or overly detailed, but enough to make it crystal clear Sarah's victim story didn't match reality. The comment section turned from supportive to deeply skeptical really fast. Why had Sarah left if she wanted her kids so badly? Why had she moved in with a boyfriend immediately? Had she been cheating? Sarah couldn't answer those questions without admitting things she didn't want to admit. So, she just started frantically deleting comments and blocking people, which made her look even worse. Then, about a week later, Mike posted a photo with some new woman. They were at a restaurant, looking very much like a couple, and the caption was something about finally drama-free. He didn't mention Sarah at all. Didn't even acknowledge she existed. You could tell from the comments that people who knew him were genuinely congratulating him on getting out of whatever mess he'd been involved in. Sarah showed up at the house 3 days after that. Ashley was with her again. She asked if we could talk about finding closure, maybe working toward fixing things. She actually said, "Most men would have fought for me." Like she expected me to be devastated that she'd moved on, or begging for another chance. I told her very clearly that I hadn't fought for her. I'd fought for our children's safety and stability, and those were two completely different things. She tried to keep talking, but I closed the door. Not angrily, just, finally. I watched through the window as she stood on the porch, looking genuinely confused, before Ashley led her back to the car. The final piece fell into place 2 months later when Robert and Margaret officially put the house into a trust for Ethan and Chloe, with me designated as the trustee and occupant until they turned 18. Sarah tried to fight it through her lawyer, but there was literally nothing to fight. It was their property, and their decision. She actually showed up at Robert's office demanding to know how they could do this to her, and apparently, she made such a scene that building security had to escort her out. Looking back, the biggest lesson is the difference between reacting emotionally and responding strategically. Sarah made every decision based on what she wanted in the moment. She never thought about long-term consequences or how her actions would look under scrutiny. Meanwhile, documenting everything and staying calm turned out to be the most powerful response possible. Manipulators absolutely rely on you losing control so they can play the victim. The second you refuse to play that role, their entire strategy collapses. So, here's what I want to ask you: have you ever been in a situation where someone assumed they had leverage over you that they didn't actually have? And more importantly, when someone tries to weaponize systems like CPS or the courts against you, what's the right balance between defending yourself and not stooping to their level?